Chapter 1. Changeling. The doe twitched nervously. Her head high, her ears flicked left then right, a pair of botflies darting away from her as they danced in a quiet, rhythmic waltz. Wide brown eyes scanned the underbrush, innocent and alert, searching for any sign of danger. But she failed to detect the cold, calculating gaze that watched her intently from the thick cover of a wilting fern. Aaron crouched low, hands pressing into the moist leaf litter to steady himself. He cleared his mind, exhaling silently as he let go of his thoughts. Somewhere behind him, beyond the peaks of the mountains, a frost cat stalked its prey, its heartbeat faint yet distinct. The powerful muscles coiled and ready to strike. The rhythmic pulse of blood surged through the creature's veins, sending a shiver through Aaron's body. He had tracked the cat for months, a hunt that ended in him watching in awe as it had leapt down a cliff face to capture a long-horned buck. The attack had been swift, precise, inspiring. Now he reached out with his gift, channeling the racing thrum of the big cat's heart until it resonated within him, his own pulse quickening to match its tempo. Despite the chill in the air, his naked torso flushed with warmth, beads of sweat dotting his skin, and his linen trousers clung to him like a damp second skin. His breath began to steam. The doe lowered her head, her nose sifting through the damp leaves in search of sulking wort and leaf root. There was a chance she had consumed enough of the toxic leaf to dull her senses. Perhaps with the frost cat's help, she would be his. Aaron waited. Long moments passed as he observed in predatory silence. 3 times the doe raised her head and sniffed at the air, each time slowly returning to the unearthed treasures beneath her. His legs twitched, a sudden jolt that dragged him forward and nearly pitched him headlong through the ferns where he crouched, their fronds quivering with his near stumble. In the mountains, the hunt was on. The frost cat surged into action, its powerful muscles rippling, and Aaron's own limbs shivered in sympathetic tension, his head pounding. Still he remained motionless. Timing was everything. The doe, oblivious to the growing danger, spread her front quarters, nose deep in the soil, tail flicking with contentment. It was time. In a single synchronized movement, Aaron and the frost cat pounced. Aaron exploded from the underbrush. The doe lurched sideways, hooves flailing as she reared. But Aaron had already cast his rope. The bola whizzed through the air, its leather thong looping around the doe's rear hocks. She kicked her legs, but the knot held fast. Aaron landed awkwardly, his heart pounding in his chest, the cacophony of the frost cat's brutal struggle filling his mind with a tempest of bloodlust. His muscles convulsed in tandem with the big cat, instinct trying to overpower reason as he fought to regain his composure. He had to let the link go. The fine rope sped through his now clumsy fingers with each desperate kick of the doe's legs. He clamped his hands shut, bracing himself, then hauled backwards with all his strength, yanking her down to the ground. In an instant, he was upon her. The doe bucked wildly on her side, arching her back in a desperate attempt to roll out from beneath him. But Aaron was faster, his legs locking around her, his grip unyielding. He fought to keep her still, wrestling her head down, and with a growl of satisfaction, he pressed her chin firmly into the soft flesh of her throat, securing her. It took but a moment to complete his task. When he stood, the doe was free of the rope, tugging hard against the halter he had fastened around her antlers.
"That won't do,"
he muttered, his tone scornful. Holding the lead rope firm, he searched through the churned soil and snapped off a small black flower of leaf root.
"Steady now, girl."
He allowed her to take the dark flower from his palm, the black sap staining his hand, before pausing to check her over. She had fled the farm during the night. A storm felled a tree, drove the herd to the far corner of the paddock. In the chaos, a few had taken advantage of the gap in the fence the old oak had created. As his uncle's prize breeding doe, Aaron was relieved to have found her before a hungry pack of wolves, or before she could reach the frost cat's territory. The others, he thought grimly, would have to fend for themselves. For now. He ran his hand down the doe's neck and over her withers, only to pull it back, sticky and bloodied. 4 puncture wounds marked where he had pinned her, blood trickling down his fingers. They were swollen, flesh thickened into cat-like pads, and his long dark nails glistened with the warm fluid.
Sorry, little one,
He murmured, his voice soft as he stroked her neck.
I held on too long.
He sighed.
Now we'll both be in for it.
When the doe finally stilled beneath his ministrations, Aaron shook his hand, waiting for the inevitable pins and needles to follow. In the distance, the sound of hammer on wood echoed from the valley floor. Duncan was already at work repairing the fence. Lead rope in his good hand, Aaron started back down the winding trail, the doe following tentatively behind him. High on a bluff, the quartet of bells from the Isander monastery tolled merrily, calling the faithful to mass. Through the parted treetops, a glimpse of the ancient stone bell tower appeared. The bells would sing for most of the morning, their sound ringing out across the valley until the loyal masses navigated the winding path and arrived at the abbey gates. For 800 years, the Isander monks had served as the steadfast guardians of Havenvale. The abbey, a stone sentinel, stood perched midway along the western side of the valley, halfway up the long dormant slopes of Thine. From this vantage point, the stout drum towers afforded the monks a perfect view of both the valley's northern and southern passes. The bells always brought Aaron's old tutor to mind. Once a priest of Isander, Sethan had been charged with much of Aaron's formal education and spiritual development. As a child, Aaron had grown very fond of Seth. As a young man, he had grown to love him. Seth's sudden departure from the valley 3 years ago had left Aaron with no word of him since. Yet, the tolling of the abbey bells every 6th day served as a constant reminder of what he had lost. Sell Day was a day of rest and reckoning. Debts settled, burials made, and the clergy did seem to thrive on driving bitter memories into the hearts of the faithful. He broke from the trail onto a rutted road leading to Oakdale, the southernmost of 6 quaint villages scattered along the valley from north to south. Thick oaks lined either side of the road, their heavy branches entwining overhead to block all but a few narrow beams of sunlight. The valley, largely self-sufficient and remote from much of the empire, saw little traffic along the southern road, especially as spring wore on. Trade caravans had long stopped arriving, and travelers were few and far between. Most opted for the easier, more traveled passes of Moosagna, where the presence of an imperial garrison made the highways safer, free of bandits, or so Duncan claimed. The lead rope dangled loosely, tapping the ground between Aaron and the doe as they meandered down the narrow roadway. If he took his time, he might arrive timely enough for Duncan to have finished all the heavy work. After the morning he'd had, the last thing Aaron felt like doing was repairing a fence. He should have known better than to hold the link with the Frostcat for so long. To call upon a change was one thing, something graceful, and for Aaron, natural. But stopping one was an entirely different venture. His head would be pounding for days, and if he didn't eat soon, he'd be lucky to stay awake for the rest of the morning. The doe tugged at the rope. 2 riders approached from the village at a trot. Aaron eased the doe off the side of the road, soothing her with soft, calming coos as he slipped his tingling hand into his trouser pocket. The valley had once been the haunt of a werewolf, and though the beast had long since been slain, or moved on, depending on the tale being recited, its terror still lingered in the hearts of the locals. Aaron kept his talents a closely guarded secret, one that not even Duncan knew about. The lead rider drew level with him and halted. Her heavy cloak did little to conceal the boiled leather armor beneath. Warm yet calculating eyes watched him through a tousled fringe of golden curls as her companion trotted past.
Good morning, Tiana.
Aaron offered her a sheepish smile.
Aaron,
She nodded in greeting, then looked up the roadway.
what have you been about this morning?
Aaron had half a mind to tell her his business was his own. His pounding head was darkening his mood, and engaging in small talk was about as enticing as hammering nails into fence posts. But being curt with an imperial churari was not a wise course of action. Instead, he held his smile in place and flicked the lead rope over his shoulder.
Forest trail, tracking this doe. She got out last night.
We spoke with your uncle a few minutes ago.
Tiana cut him off.
He said you were out here. Haven't seen anybody in your travels? Or any suspicious tracks?
You're the first people I've seen since leaving the farm.
Aaron replied, his tone easy despite the tension in his head.
You'd know them if you'd found them.
Tiana leaned forward in her saddle as her horse pissed a hot stream, splashing across the ground. Aaron took a step back.
Just keep clear of anyone you see digging around the trails, especially anyone asking after Leith root.
Leith?
Aaron's brow furrowed.
Why would anyone want Leith?
Tiana returned his smile, but there was nothing friendly in it.
Ask your priest friend.
Seth?
The Chirari offered no further explanation as she sat back in her saddle and nudged her horse to trot off, joining her companion. Aaron's heart skipped. Why would Tiana mention Seth? Had he returned? Had she seen him on the road? Aaron hurried along, the doe prancing behind to keep up. Could it be possible that Seth had been helping Duncan with the fence, even as Aaron was tracking the doe? As excited as he was at the prospect of being reunited with his friend and mentor, by the time he reached Duncan, he was exhausted. Perspiration gleamed off his shoulders as he gasped for breath, each inhale laborious. The trees soon gave way to blue sky as Aaron emerged at the outskirts of the farm he called home. A wide field of lush grass rose up the gentle slope to the farmhouse and outbuildings. In the far corner, closest to the stable, Duncan's pair of white shepherd hounds kept a dozen head of deer herded together. One of the dogs squared off with a young buck. The deer lowered its antlers and stomped at the ground, challenging the dog. But the dog dropped to its front haunches and let out a deep bark. The sound startled the rest of the herd, and chaos ensued for a moment, before the hounds swiftly brought the situation under control, darting back and forth to keep the deer in the corner. Further along the fence line, a tall spruce lay split in two. Though not exceptionally large by the valley's standards, the felled trunk had destroyed an entire panel of fencing. His uncle had been busy since Aaron had left in search of the doe. A section of the offending tree already lay cut away, the shattered timber cleared. From the rhythmic hammering, Aaron could tell Duncan was well on his way to replacing the broken runners. With his head pounding, Aaron hurried along, pulling the stubborn doe behind him. He may have hoped Duncan had finished the hard work before he returned, but now that he was home, a sudden pang of guilt washed over him. He stopped, hands on his knees, gasping for air. Duncan's head popped up from the other side of the trunk, his thick beard parting in a wide grin.
By the god, you found her.
Aaron nodded in reply, fighting to catch his breath, and waved back down the roadway.
What happened? Duncan's eyes narrowed. What's wrong with your hand?
The rapid-fire questions made Aaron freeze. He had been waving with the very hand he'd been trying to hide. Hesitantly, he held it up for inspection. Much of the blood had already been wiped off in his trouser pocket, but a red smear still stained his palm and congealed beneath his fingernails. Nails that were longer than normal, but thankfully no longer black. His fingers still tingled, but the flesh wasn't thick and padded. Inwardly sighing with relief, he wiped the rest of the blood on his trouser leg.
It's the doe.
Aaron shortened the lead rope and turned her so Duncan could see the wounds.
I think a frost cat had a go at her.
He lied. Duncan frowned.
How far up the range was she?
Not that far. I guess she headed for home after the cat gave her a scare.
Duncan let the hardwood rail fall from his calloused hands and vaulted effortlessly over the tree, landing with a thud on legs corded with muscle born of years hauling timber and hefting stone. He brushed sawdust from his thick forearms, the motion deliberate, before taking the lead rope in his broad grip. Inspecting the gore with a low click of his tongue, he muttered,
You silly old girl. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to leave us.
A flick of the wrist brought a hammer out of the loop in his belt, and he handed it to Aaron without taking his eyes off the doe.
Set the last 3 runners, while I take this fool of an animal up to the barn and see to this mess.
Aaron's shoulders slumped, but he made no protest.
Then head up to the house. Melissa is making a special morning tea. We have a guest.
Seth?
No, Duncan's eyebrows rose quizzically. Why would you think the priest returned? Aaron scratched the back of his head absently, trying to hide his disappointment.
Just something Tiana said.
What did that Churari viper have to say this time? Duncan rolled his eyes and tucked a thumb into the belt loop from which he'd plucked the hammer.
She said I should ask Seth about Leith Root.
He looked sidelong at Duncan.
Do you know what she means?
Ah, Aaron. Duncan nodded, understanding. That I do. And the fact that you don't is testament to your kind heart. You never see the ill in those you love. It was Aaron's turn to frown. However, the Viper is right. That is a matter you'll have to ask him yourself. Duncan gave him a firm clap on the shoulder. Now get these runners done. We don't want our guest kept waiting. Aaron climbed over the fallen tree, his entire body slouched in disappointment. He didn't care whether he kept the visitor waiting, didn't even care who it was. It wasn't Seth, so it just didn't matter. Suddenly, the pressure building behind his eyes sent his vision grey and faded, and his stomach panged savagely. Food and rest were the only cures for his particular ailment, and if that meant sitting through a boring conversation with one of Duncan and Melissa's friends from the village, then so be it, even if it was another one of Oakdale's desperate spinsters. If there was one thing the valley was never short of, it was eligible young ladies Aunt Melissa was keen to push Aaron's way. Not that he was opposed to the attention or the seemingly limitless selection. Aaron just preferred to attend the valley's markets and festivals, where liquor flowed cheaply and skirts were hoisted just as readily, without the mind-numbing conversation that accompanied regular courtship. It was a different kind of hunt, but one he enjoyed no less. Despite his headache, the fence didn't take as long as he thought. Duncan had already cut the tree away and replaced 5 of the 8 broken runners. Once finished, Aaron climbed down and surveyed his handiwork. His runners weren't as level as Duncan's, but there was no way any of the deer would be jumping over. Running his hands through matted hair, he wiped sweat from his brow. A sharp whistle broke the dogs away from their guard duties and brought them bounding down the hill towards him, tails wagging and tongues lolling from the sides of their mouths. He gave each a playful rub behind the ears and headed up the gentle slope to the stone cottage. A long line of smoke drifting from the chimney was the only outward sign of life. No horse and cart was tethered by the stable, so that ruled out female company, at least the kind that Aunt Melissa associated with anyway. As he approached, however, Duncan's raised voice bellowed from within the stable. Aaron slowed, letting the dogs race ahead to the cottage. A desperate lilt to his uncle's voice, one never heard before, gave the lad pause. Prancing on the balls of his feet, he crept up to the closed door and peered through the narrow gap in the timber panels. Duncan was arguing with someone out of view. Certainly not Melissa, judging by the savagery of his uncle's side of the exchange. But all Aaron could make out was the subtle movement of shadow cast by the other party. Duncan paused in his tirade long enough to shake his head and slap a heavy fist into his meaty palm. "Well?" He eyed the shadows expectantly. The shadows spoke, a calm monotone that warned of simmering wrath, yet spoke of infinite patience. Aaron knew the voice, but it had been so long ago that he at first did not place a face to it. A chill ran down his spine.
You were warned not to become too attached.
Too attached? Duncan's voice raised in pitch as he paced in and out of Aaron's view. How could we not? For 18 years we've raised him as our own. Melissa and I have known the joy of watching the boy's first steps, to the pride of seeing his first harvest dance.
You knew this day would come.
Aye, Duncan stilled and slouched in resignation. And yet we had hoped after all this time you would leave him. He has come so far. His tracking skills are second to none. Why, even the Valley Rangers have expressed interest in recruiting him. For them to seek out a recruit is unheard of. He could live such a happy life here.
What? Marry a peasant girl and sire a tribe of grandchildren for you and Melissa to dote over?
Is that so much to ask? We've done all you asked. Can we not wish he be left in peace, to grow in happiness?
Aaron has his own path to follow. Whether it leads to happiness will depend upon the boy.
But the danger?
Will be no less than what he has been exposed to his entire life.
The shadow stilled. Duncan glanced at the door. "What is it?"
Outside.
Aaron stepped back as a gentle breeze blew at his back. He spun on his heels, and the world split. A seam in the air widened with a sigh of torn silk, and from it bled swirls of ghost-grey energy, coiling like smoke where no fire burned. Out of that rift, a shape emerged, massive, bent, yet terrible in its stride. The man stepped through reality itself. The swirls clung to him for a heartbeat longer, whispering against the edges of his form like the breath of memory. His frame was crooked, his gait uneven, but the energy that danced in his wake said otherwise. Hard charcoal eyes locked on Aaron, their pupils alive with white liquid fire, swirling like runes half-formed. Aaron recoiled. He had forgotten, foolishly, that the man's limp was a lie told by flesh. The crippled shape veiled a speed arcane in nature, swift enough to outrun thought. His hands rose too late. A heavy fist struck him in the sternum. The breath burst from him in a great whoosh, and he crumpled backward, landing on his backside with a bruised grunt.
I would have thought eavesdropping to be an unvirtuous pastime.
The veil-threaded glow in the man's eyes dimmed, leaving behind pupils as black as root-deep shadows.
What would your priest say?
Aaron struggled for breath, inhaling long and deliberately. Duncan emerged from the stable just as he was able to speak again. The youth glanced at his uncle before casting a disparaging glare at the man standing over him. He cursed himself. He had forgotten how the cripple walked through walls. Forgotten that this man's silence was not a kindness, but the stillness before a blade's thrust.
Seth would have said there's eavesdropping, and then there's knowing when to listen.
Aaron wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve, then met the man's gaze.
One might bruise your pride. The other saves your life.
The big man laughed, deep and rough, stepping forward with an awkward gait. His back twisted and hunched beneath a cloak stained by long roads and ash weather. His dark skin bore the sun-burnished hue of the Ashani steppes, and his hands, though calloused and scarred, moved with care as he offered Aaron the butt of his walking staff. Aaron hesitated, then took it. Coulter hauled him up without effort.
I should have expected our fallen priest to pass on looser wisdom than those preening monks in their stone tower.
He muttered. His gaze lingered on Aaron, studying something behind the boy's eyes. The humor faded. His brow furrowed. Aaron shifted, suddenly conscious of being seen too deeply. Coulter turned away, speaking over his shoulder.
So, Seth's sharpened your tongue, though clearly dulled your stance. No matter. I'll have you brawling passably by week's end. You'll need it.
Need it?
Aaron planted both feet.
I'm not going anywhere, Uncle.
Coulter's laughter came again, but this time hollow as a broken bell.
Ah, young pup,
He said, his voice low.
You speak as if you've a say in the matter.
Through the ashes of broken dreams, he walks alone, seeking redemption for sins that weren't his own. A vagabond, general with a soul of steel. A scarlet letter of a truth concealed.
Coulter relished the peace of the barn, a rare solace he could seldom find these days. There were few places that offered such tranquility, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Duncan's barn was one of them. Perhaps it was the history between him and Duncan, years of hard-fought battles when his old friend had saved his life more times than Coulter could count. Or maybe it was simply Duncan's reputation that had followed him to the valley, earning a respect that bordered on fear. Here in Haven Vale, no one dared challenge Duncan, not among the Izander-worshipping folk anyway. There were never any unwanted visitors, and that made the place feel secure. It could have also been the simplicity of it all. Behind the sheltering peaks of Haven Vale, within the dim light of the barn, the oppressive weight of the outside world seemed to dissipate. In this quiet corner of the valley, it felt as though peace could still be found. Coulter shifted uncomfortably on the hay bale, his old hip protesting the stillness. As he adjusted, a soft knock on the barn door broke the silence. He quickly scrambled for his glasses, thick tinted lenses so dark they were almost black, just in time to shield his eyes from the sunlight streaming through the doorway. The door creaked open, and Melissa entered, her presence serene. Noticing his discomfort, she quietly closed the door behind her, leaning against it with her hands resting gently at the small of her back. Despite her consideration, Coulter kept his glasses in place, allowing them to serve as a barrier between his thoughts and his expression, giving him an unreadable demeanor. Melissa, still striking despite the years, had a fire-red mane now muted with strands of grey, and the fine lines of age and care traced around her eyes. Yet in many ways she seemed largely unchanged by the years that had passed. She wore the same faded and tattered dress, no doubt a relic from their earlier years, now showing the wear of a life spent in the demanding hands of the land.
Melissa,
He said, his voice low as he struggled to his feet.
the years have been kind to you.
Not so much to you, General.
She replied sharply, her words thick with unspoken bitterness. Her venom was thinly veiled, a reminder that some wounds, no matter how time-worn, never quite heal. No, she hadn't changed at all.
It appears the human body can only endure so much before it turns on you.
Coulter replied, maintaining his cordial tone. He had to, after all. She was the love of Duncan's life.
Your husband's early retirement was most fortuitous.
So it would seem.
Melissa's eyes swept the barn, her gaze lingering on everything but him, as if she was seeing it all for the first time. Her tension was palpable, and she made no effort to meet his gaze.
Where's Duncan?
Coulter asked.
Helping Aaron pack.
She answered, her voice subdued.
So you thought you'd come out here and keep me entertained?
He took a step toward her, his limp dragging his bad leg through the straw-covered floor. His imposing presence, despite his physical limitations, still carried weight. Melissa recoiled instinctively, turning her head to avoid his eyes, her gaze firmly averted. Coulter paused in his approach. Even behind the dark lenses, his piercing stare seemed to strip away the layers between them, prying deeper than words could convey.
What is it you want, Melissa?
His voice was edged with impatience.
I want to thank you.
She blurted, her voice breaking as she hastily wiped away a tear with a trembling hand.
Thank me? I may have agreed to this ruse of yours. I'll take the boy beyond the safety of Haven's passes. But, God, woman, do you have any idea how big a mistake you and Duncan are making?
Coulter's voice was edged with frustration.
Aaron needs to leave the valley. He needs to experience the world outside so that he may find his rightful place in it.
Melissa's eyes met his at last, her expression pleading for him to believe the carefully constructed lies, both those spoken and those left unsaid.
And his place isn't here.
Coulter's gaze hardened, a quiet accusation in the question. She blinked back more tears, shaking her head.
Melissa, you both love the boy. That much is clear, otherwise you wouldn't feel the need to orchestrate this deception. You just tell him to get out and be done with it. What's changed?
Melissa hesitated, her lips trembling with the words she couldn't speak. Finally, she pointed toward the stairs leading up to the loft.
It would be easier if I showed you.
She gestured for him to lead the way.
Stairs.
Coulter muttered under his breath as he gripped the balustrade and hauled himself up one laborious step at a time.
Why is it always stairs?
At the head of the stairs, the air was thick with dust, motes swirling in the narrow beams of sunlight that filtered through the barn's upper windows. As a child, Aaron had called them dust angels. Coulter swiped at his nose, his eyes stinging as he reached the landing. A stifled cough escaped him, and he leaned against the balustrade, giving himself a moment to catch his breath.
It's at the far end.
Melissa pointed down a narrow path between rows of stacked hay bales. Coulter's cloak caught on the chaff as he made his way through the loft, stepping carefully around the bales. At the far end, the fodder gave way to a small alcove. A single window above cast a beam of dust-choked sunlight onto a cluttered table. Coulter glanced at Melissa before proceeding. As he drew closer, mottled feathers drifted across the floor at his feet with every step.
What is this?
He asked, his voice low as the pungent stench of rotting meat filled the narrow space.
This is what Aaron does with his spare time.
Melissa's voice was distant, and she remained poised at the entrance, unwilling to step any closer. Coulter looked from her to the table, his eyes narrowing in recognition. A dead eagle lay stretched across the surface, its wings splayed out and nailed to the wood. One wing still held its full complement of feathers, but the rest of the bird had been stripped clean. Feathers lay scattered about the floor, and long strips of skin were peeled back, exposing delicate joints and corded muscle, already turning green with decay. Coulter's gaze lingered on the gruesome sight before him. His eyes fell to a blood-stained arrow, discarded on the side, and he picked it up in awe.
I had no idea the boy had become such a good marksman,
he murmured, his fingers tracing the shaft of the arrow, examining its craftsmanship.
Good marksman?
Melissa exclaimed, her voice thick with disbelief.
This doesn't disturb you?
The academies in Ren-Karen and Brion are filled with men who do such things. They call it science.
Coulter shrugged nonchalantly.
The boy has an inquisitive mind.
The boy is trying to learn how to fly.
Melissa planted both fists on her hips, her posture stiff with anger as she squared her shoulders at him.
That's absurd.
Coulter raised an eyebrow.
What's he going to do? Sprout feathers? Grow wings and…
He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes catching the impatient tapping of Melissa's foot.
Sander, how long have you known?
What he is?
Her voice cracked, rising in shrill frustration.
I've suspected since he was 3. Every time he had a tantrum, something would change in him. Only subtly, like his eye color, but still. Enough for a mother to notice. Even an adoptive mother. Duncan, the fool, thought if we could steer him down Isander's enlightened path, Aaron would fight the temptation to touch the evil within him.
Evil? God, what do you think he is?
Coulter's voice was tinged with disbelief.
This valley has been home to my family for 8 generations,
she said, her tone rising as she began to shout.
We've seen his ilk before. As a child, I lived through Wyatt Litterman's reign of terror. Entire families were butchered by that monster.
Haven Vale's fabled werewolf.
Coulter scoffed.
Aaron is no werewolf, Melissa. At best, he's
an abomination!
She hissed the words, tears breaking free and streaking down her flushed cheeks.
You promised me a child, General. Remember? The morning Duncan brought you to our tent where I lay bleeding on the physician's pallet. The crossbow bolt barely removed from my dying womb, and the dead child within.
She sobbed helplessly, reliving the agony once more.
There will be hundreds of orphans that need a mother's love when Brian falls, you whispered to Duncan. I heard you. Don't you dare try to deny it. You and Melissa shall have your child, I promise.
She wiped uselessly at her tears, her breath ragged.
You promised us a child, and gave me this.
She thrust her hand at the table, pointing at the grisly display before her.
I will not see the boy I raised grow into a monster.
Melissa, he's not a…
Coulter began, but Melissa silenced him with a sharp, cold cut of her hand.
Get out.
She hissed through gritted teeth, her voice seething with barely contained fury.
Take Aaron and leave my home. Now.
She stepped aside just far enough to let him pass, her sobs echoing after him as he made his way out of the barn. Outside, Duncan stood where Coulter had propped his pack against the broken wheel of a disused cart. The old soldier was at ease, his posture stiff, eyes cast over the lower paddocks in the greater valley beyond, lost in thought.
Where's the boy?
Coulter asked, his tone quiet but curious. Duncan glanced sidelong at him, offering a small smile. Don't let Aaron hear you call him that. He's a man grown now. Coulter arched a brow.
Tell me, old friend, if you could do things over, would you still accept the babe when Emella offered him to you?
Duncan didn't hesitate. his voice filled with warmth and pride.
I wouldn't change a thing.
Coulter's gaze sharpened.
Then why spurn the boy now?
Duncan's expression darkened as he looked out across the land, his tone shifting to one of deep concern. He seemed reluctant to speak at first, but finally turned his eyes to Coulter.
Did you have those ridiculous spectacles on when you spoke with her?
Melissa? Yes. I have to wear them most days now.
Coulter replied, his voice softer than usual.
The lupus?
Duncan asked with quiet urgency. Coulter drew a slow breath, his gaze growing distant.
Something like that. Protecting my eyes from bright light has calmed me. I no longer carry the rage of yesteryear. I am more at peace. Why do you ask?
You wouldn't have seen it.
Duncan sighed deeply, his eyes dropping to the ground.
Her eyes tell the worst of it, but even her skin is turning yellow now.
Coulter's face tightened in understanding. He knew the signs. Both of them had seen enough men die from a failed liver to know what that meant.
Aaron doesn't understand. He thinks she's just ill. We haven't told him.
Coulter's jaw tightened as the weight of Duncan's words settled in. He gave a small nod.
So you don't want him here when she dies?
Duncan's shoulders slumped under the weight of his own thoughts.
He's scared, General, and not just of her own mortality. She's terrified of what will become of Aaron. He doesn't take loss well. When Seth left like he did, it changed him. He's quick to anger, and I've had several complaints from irate fathers over his rough handling of their daughters.
Rape!
Coulter echoed, incredulity lacing his voice.
Hell no. He's just been accused of overzealousness,
Duncan replied with a heavy sigh.
Truth be told, I think the fathers are more vexed by his refusal to make honest women out of any of them. But Melissa, she fears what he will do in his grief when she's gone. She won't spend her last days in fear of a future she will have no part in. I'll not have it. Can you understand that?
Coulter ran a hand through his beard, his face drawn with frustration.
Duncan, do you realize the complications you are forcing upon me? There could not be worse timing.
And I would not dare ask if I didn't think you owed me,
Duncan said, his voice firm but with an undercurrent of quiet plea. Coulter's jaw clenched and relaxed as he mulled over those words. The weight of the unspoken history between them hung in the air, thick and palpable.
And there we have it.
He muttered under his breath.
The one phrase that's guaranteed to end friendships.
Duncan handed him his walking cane, a silent gesture of understanding.
You're leaving now? Aaron's not ready.
Coulter shrugged, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the situation.
You heard your wife. She wants me gone. The boy can catch up.
He threw his hand up in the air in exasperation.
Should I fill his head with dreams of a destiny now thrust upon him? Shall I stroke his fragile ego with tales of how he will walk the path of dead kings and change the shape of the empire?
Duncan smirked dryly, a brief flicker of amusement passing through his eyes before they shadowed with something darker.
A child plucked from the ashes of a razed city and spirited away to an isolated vale, placed in the protective hands of a trusted friend to be raised as his own. A child that now displays mysterious talents.
He laughed softly, though there was no joy in it.
Ha! It all smacks of destiny, my friend.
His eyes grew distant, haunted by something only he truly understood.
Whilst his lineage still intrigues me, I once entertained that Aaron was the lost heir of Brion, a surviving sprog of Michael's or some high-ranking lord of House Corchester. Had I not seen with my own eyes how relentless the Bairn Slayer had been in ending that bloodline, I would have entertained the theory longer.
They only call me that in the outer provinces,
Coulter mused, his voice low and reflective.
These days I carry a more vulgar tag. Now I am simply the butcher.
The common folk have lost their sense of poetry, it would seem,
Duncan remarked with a wry smile.
The arch-Rithen, you mean?
Coulter growled the name with palpable loathing.
He paints me more vile than ever, hoping to alienate me from the few allies I have left.
It was a time of war,
Duncan said, his voice softer.
We all did things we are not proud of.
I have done things Adira would balk at,
Coulter replied, his gaze lifting to the darkening sky.
Both then and since.
Duncan studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful.
Since when have you cared for the opinions of rumor-mongers who were not there in Mikhail's great hall that day?
Since those opinions started closing doors to the information networks I've spent years cultivating,
Coulter muttered, his tone tinged with frustration. Duncan looked at his friend searchingly. Few knew Coulter Voltin's motivations, and even fewer were trusted enough to be told by Coulter himself. Duncan was one of those rare, elite few.
How goes the search?
stalled.
Coulter sighed, scratching at his bald head, then pulling his hood up.
Yet again. Some days I think they are within my grasp, then hope slips away like a dream upon waking. With what Amela and I now set in motion, I hope to gain fresh resources.
Duncan gripped his friend's shoulder reassuringly, his voice steady. You will find them. Of that I am certain.
I grow old, Duncan, as do they. And this lupus gains on me. What point is there in searching, only to find graves or fall into my own?
Coulter's words were heavy with the weight of time and regret. That has always been a possibility, Duncan replied, his voice steady. You've said as much yourself. To hope for anything else is to entertain a fool's folly.
Life is a fool's folly, my friend.
Coulter tapped his cane on the ground, his steps slow and deliberate as he continued his awkward gait. Duncan watched him for a moment, then asked, Where will you go? Coulter glanced over his shoulder.
Why do you care?
So I can get word to you when she is gone, Duncan said quietly, shuffling his feet. And you can send my son back home.
Ren-Karen,
Coulter replied, turning to face the long path leading to the valley highway.
But address any correspondence to Amela. I'll be handing him over to her at the first chance I get. And keep to the usual channels. Imperial entanglement will undo everything we've worked for these last 20 years.
He paused for a moment, his expression unreadable, then turned back to face Duncan one last time.
When Melissa finally passes, I hope she leaves it for you.
What's that? Duncan asked, confused.
The thing that would make any other man fight to keep his child.
Coulter replied, his voice colder now. He turned away, his gaze sharp and distant.
Your manhood.